Well, here we go. Third week, third round, if you will, with dealing with the social principles and book of resolutions in our denomination. Let's remember we're dealing with principles that the leaders of the church adopt, encouraging us to consider these principles before we make decisions or we form opinions. They're not doing our thinking for us. It's principles that they hope that we will consider before we make decisions or we form opinions. And then resolutions are advices that we are to consider, not advices that we are to automatically adhere to. Sometimes we accept advice, sometimes reject advice, but part of our advice system as United Methodists is the Book of Resolutions. So we dealt with healthcare, we dealt with immigration, and today we're going to deal with another issue of our day, and that is science and technology. And I wouldn't have believed 20 years ago that this would have been a significant issue today, but in our culture, in the United States today, it's a factor in many conversations. That is the importance of scientific inquiry. How influential should scientific perspective be in our decision making and in our opinion forming? And specifically, is there a conflict between science and faith? I don't want us to get trapped in the United States perspective on this issue, but it is important where we live today. For instance, with the pandemic, with COVID-19, are we to listen to and be guided by the scientific community, or are we to disregard the scientific community as we form opinion and make decisions? That's a crucial question that's going on in the minds of almost everyone in our culture today. It's a daily decision, if you will, for all of us, not only concerning COVID-19, but climate change. Do we listen to or are willing to be guided by the scientific community? Now, the reality is, the reason we need to talk about this in the context of the church is that many resist advice from the scientific community because of their faith. Let me say that again. Many resist advice from the scientific community because of their faith. Now, historically, we can trace this phenomenon of faith versus science, but I'm not going to try to unpack that today, except to say that the heart of the commitment of the anti-scientific attitude is known by some of us as the great divide between science and faith. And that divide is anchored in an understanding that the Genesis story of creation is in fact history. Now, we could deal with Genesis 1 to 11 in a whole nother journey of study, but let me just say that Darwin's theory of evolution and scientific creationism anchored in Genesis 2 and 3 is the source of the great divide. Now, a couple of stories in relationship to that. Some of us are acquainted with the history of Southwestern. In the United States, there was the Scopes trial in terms of the issue of evolution in the 1920s. One of the persons that was called to advocate that there was no great divide between science and religion, and evolution was a very acceptable understanding of creation to those persons of faith, was a professor at Southwestern College. A lot of us aren't aware of that story, but it's a fascinating story that a professor here at Southwestern was invited to offer testimony to the trial, which he was not called, but he was there and present and accounted for, if you will. But a more modern story, when Bishop Hicks was in Arkansas, that would have been in the 80s before he came to Kansas as our bishop, he and his attorney, his counsel, worked together with the Arkansas legislature when it was proposed in the state of Arkansas that scientific creationism would be introduced in the public school curriculum as a fact and as science. That indeed there was an event 10,000 years ago or 20,000 years ago that initiated the creation process, and that evolution was taught in the schools, and that was anti-faith, and therefore the movement was for scientific creationism to be presented along with evolution in the public schools in Arkansas. But Bishop Hicks, interestingly enough, regardless of your political affiliation, his counsel, the legal counsel for the United Methodist Church in the state of Arkansas at that time, was a person that is known a lot more than Bishop Hicks, and it happened to be Hillary Clinton. But those two persons are credited in Arkansas with the decision of the legislature not to adopt scientific creationism as required curriculum in the schools alongside the theory of evolution. Bishop Hicks and I were very, very close, good buddies, good friends, and he told me about speaking to the legislative committee and then to the full legislative session. And he shared with me how crucial it was to have the social principle of the United Methodist Church in his hands as he read to the legislature. And as he also told them that the Genesis story is not presented in the Hebrew tradition as fact or as a history, is not in the history section of the Bible, but rather it's a story dealing with why there is creation to give glory to the God of love, and that we, in faith, deal with the question of why. We allow science to deal with the question of what happened, how it happened, and when it happened. And on the basis of that presentation to the legislature voted not to include scientific creationism as a part of public school curriculum. Now, I share those stories only to put in context the social principles of the United Methodist Church. It's crucial that all of us understand that we stand in the tradition that there's no conflict between scientific inquiry and the inquiry of faith. Let me say it again. There's no conflict between scientific inquiry dealing with what, when, and how, and the faith community's inquiry concerning why. Now let's turn to the social principle on science and technology. I'm going to read the full paragraph because sentence by sentence it is so profound and is a resource throughout the faith community, not only in the United Methodist Church. Quote, "We recognize science as a legitimate interpretation of God's natural world. We affirm the validity of the claims of science in describing the natural world and in determining what is scientific. We preclude science from making authoritative claims about theological issues, and theology from making authoritative claims about scientific issues. End of quote, but it goes both ways. We find that science's description of cosmological, geological, and biological evolution are not in conflict with theology. We recognize medical, technical, and scientific technologies as legitimate uses of God's natural world when such use enhances human life and enables all of God's children to develop their God-given creative potential without violating ethical convictions about the relationship of humanity to the natural world. Friends, that's who we are as United Methodists. That's the principle that the church offers to you and to me and to every United Methodist to consider as we are making decisions, as we are forming opinions, to realize that the scientific inquiry has many, many gifts to offer. Now, that being our social principle, that we could unpack sentence by sentence and spend a half a dozen weeks on it. Maddie was a part of a group a year ago last summer, the Micah group. She had them on in one of our worship experiences this summer in terms of the journey with the social principles, and she could do a good job of us of taking that line by line and unpacking our journey together in terms of science and technology. But the first thing I want us to turn to is an interesting resolution based on this principle concerning genetic science. And the reason that I'm sort of fond of this is that I happen to be a part of the Board of Church and Society when it was decided that we needed to address genetics, not as a part of our book of law, but as a part of our book of advices, because we had a scientific community of laity that needed to be affirmed in their inquiry and in their quest. It was an interesting task force that was formed. 6 United Methodist scientists from throughout the world and 1 theologian on the group of 7. They came back with this statement in terms of genetic science, and this is a resolution and advice to all of us. And it reads, one of the concerns that merits critique in light of theological understandings is genetic science. The urgent task of interpreting the faith in light of the biotechnological revolution and evaluating the rapidly emerging genetic science and technology has only begun. The issues demand continuing dialogue at all levels of the church as persons from diverse perspectives seek to discern and live out God's vision for creation. God has given human beings the capacity for research and technological invention, but the worship of science is idolatry. Now, remember what I said in introducing this resolution. This is the language of leading scientists who happen to be United Methodists. Genetic techniques have enormous potential for sustaining creation and for some improving the quality of human life when they are applied to environmental, agricultural, and medical problems. When used positively, though limited and imperfect, solutions to such perplexing social problems as insufficient food supply, spread of disease, ecological deterioration, overpopulation, and human disease. All of these can be served well through genetic engineering. The community of Christ bears witness to the truth that all persons have unity by virtue of being redeemed by Christ. Such unity respects and embraces genetic diversity, which accounts for so many differences among people. Love and justice, which scriptures uplift and which Jesus Christ supremely expresses, require that the worth and dignity of the defenseless be preserved and protected. In other words, genetic science should not be used as an advantage of one group over another. And finally, in this 6-page resolution, although genetic technologies are similar to other technologies, genetic science and technology force us as never before the meaning of life. We need to examine the meaning of life. We need to examine our understanding of ourselves as humans and our proper role in God's creation. Now, much more could be amplified and read from this resolution on genetic science. But let it be said, it was the first time a faith community, any faith community, had addressed this issue that was very, very controversial and emerging in its impact on the lives of all of us. So that's one bit of advice in terms of how we are to use genetic technology and engineering, not to take advantage of one group over the other, but rather to exercise love and justice and to enhance human life together. Now, I've referred to this before, but another resolution that is just fascinating, if you will, is the resolution on human cloning. Now, this resolution on human cloning was adopted and is revisited every 4 years because of the nature of this issue. But again, let me read from the paragraph on human cloning. Cloning has sparked enormous and sustained concern in the general public, including the church. For the purposes of this document, human cloning means the intentional production of genetically identical or essentially identical human beings and human embryos. Cloning touches on many crucial questions about human nature. It raises hopes, it raises expectations, and brings to the fore uncertainties and fears. While we do not see obvious benefits of human cloning, and while we recognize potential dangers of cloning, we also acknowledge the excitement that this new research generates for advances in medicine, agricultural, and other scientific endeavors. Then a statement of faith in terms of our value to the God of love and the value of every individual as the God of love. And therefore we submit this policy position. We call for a ban, a global ban on all human cloning, including the cloning of human embryos. We call for a ban on therapeutic, medical research, and commercial procedures which generate unused embryos for the purpose of cloning. We commit to the widespread discussion of issues related to human cloning in public discourse and in the conversation of the church. Again, advice, the advice used by both President Clinton and President Bush in public statements that read explicitly from the first resolution on genetic science. Now, we could continue with many, many resolutions. I looked at resolutions concerning climate change, science's contribution to the understanding of that, to the whole dilemma of what chemicals is doing to creation and to human life. But I just have picked one more as how it specifically relates to issues that we sometimes do not consider, but are important to the lives of many, many persons. And this has to do, again, advice concerning science and technology, gender selective abortion. My hunch is you haven't thought about that in the last week. But the church encourages to think about it, because gender selective abortion, choosing abortion solely or primarily of not preferring the unborn child's sex, is often practiced in many places in the world. Due to cultural biases, female fetuses are generally targeted for abortion, in such cases much more than males. Indeed, in 2001, a Nobel laureate published an article about how prominent this is in East Asia, China, South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, and in India and South Asia as well. So again, this is a global issue that we receive advice on. And the position of the church as far as advice is our belief in the sanctity of unborn human life and unconditionally reject abortion being used as a means of gender selection. We condemn sex-selective abortion as a particularly lamentable and violent expression of sexism. The church has affirmed the woman's right for abortion. But the church has also given advice that as this practice of abortion becomes widespread in some countries as a tool of sexism, it is to be rejected by those persons of faith. That's probably enough subject matter to introduce the whole issue of faith and scientific inquiry. I stand tall as a United Methodist for several reasons. I've always said that if for no other reason, I would be a United Methodist because of United Methodist Committee on Relief. That would be enough to convince me to be a United Methodist. That's a matter of mission. But in terms of willingness to grow and willingness to think, I stand tall as a United Methodist because we are those encouraging science, but always in the context of how it can enhance human life together, not to be used as leverage of one group over another. I just have a couple of questions for you to think about, and I know that you've raised a lot of questions in your own mind that we can discuss on Sunday. But first of all, when did you first realize that science and faith do not represent the great divide? Was that something you grew up with? Or when did you discover that science and faith can go hand in hand? But secondly, the social principle is so provocative, and it provokes this question in my mind. What are illustrations of science making authoritative claims about faith? And what are illustrations of persons of faith making authoritative claims on scientific issues? What are illustrations of how we get in trouble on this issue as persons who are encouraged to love God with all our heart, soul, strength, and mind? Have a good week.